Hello and welcome to the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. I'm Martin Jones, a human performance specialist, researcher and educator.
And I'm Jonpaul, a former Royal Army Physical Training Corps instructor turned academic. Each week we talk to world-leading experts about how to unlock the full potential of those who operate in high-stress, high-stakes environments.
We discuss the latest science, innovative strategies, practical wisdom and inspirational stories in the rapidly evolving world of human performance optimization.
The Optimizing Human Performance podcast is produced in partnership with the Wavell Room and the Tactical Athlete Performance Centre at Buckinghamshire New University.
Today we welcome Professor Michael Matthews to the podcast. Professor Matthews is a Professor of Engineering Psychology in the Department of Behavioural Sciences and Leadership at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He has authored over 250 scientific papers and is the co-editor of several leading texts, including Human Performance Optimization, The Science and Ethics of Enhancing Human Capabilities, and Headstrong, How Psychology is Revolutionizing War. In our conversation with Mike, we discussed various topics related to human performance optimization, including the importance of non-cognitive factors such as grit, developing character traits, and the role of organisational culture. Hi, Mike. Welcome to the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. How are you doing?
Well, just fine. It's a fairly early morning here in New York. This is President's Day. It's a holiday. What a perfect way to spend President's Day, talking about interesting things with interesting folk.
It's great to have you with us today. I'll let you tell us about yourself, what you do, where you are, and your current role.
Well, I'm a professor of what's called engineering psychology at West Point, United States Military Academy. We're located about 50 miles north of Manhattan, and I've been here since the year 2000 when I first joined the faculty. I teach biopsychology and cognitive psychology and other courses to the cadets, really with a focus about how to tailor that to make cadets better leaders when they eventually become officers in the United States Army. Earlier on in my life, I taught at the Air Force Academy when I was an Air Force officer. Never thought I'd turn to the dark side of being at West Point, but here I am after 24 years and still enjoying it.
Great. Thank you very much. So 20 plus years, lots changed in the world in those 20 years.
When I arrived in June of 2000, the world was quite different, both technologically and politically, and also the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in 2001. I was actually teaching class that morning in 2001 on September 11th. I remember it very distinctly that I'd taken a break after my first hour class, which started at 7:30, and I was looking at CNN just kind of kill time between classes, and there was a picture of a plane striking one of the towers, and the headline was "Small Plane Strikes Tower." It was breaking news. They didn't know what had really happened. I sat with my cadets in the subsequent 2 hours with a big screen TV on, watching everything unfold, and that was the class of 2003. These cadets were juniors at West Point then, and every single one of them went off to war. And many of them served valiantly, and some didn't come back. So it was really a life-changing event and really made what I do at West Point, which is developing leaders of character and leaders for the Army, much more tangible to me. The importance of what we do to prepare these young people to go out and face the rigors and stresses and challenges and trauma that are inherent in being an Army officer.
Mike, having read several of your texts, what I've always found fascinating was your background as a police officer and then your transition into the US Air Force. Therefore, it'd be really good if you could just take us through those experiences and how it sort of led you into the field of applied psychology.
The history of my interest in psychology is a little different than a lot of folks. I guess I knew from an early age I wanted to be a psychologist. The way that I came to that conclusion was, I believe it was my 8th grade year in school. My middle brother, who's 6 years older, he'd gone off to college, and he'd come back for Thanksgiving break, and he had his college textbooks in the back of the car. And I got to digging through them, and I found a psychology text. This is a college-level text, and I was a pure knucklehead when I was a youngster. I mean, I was not a very good student. But for some reason, that book really caught my attention. I read it from cover to cover that weekend and decided that I wanted to be a psychologist when I grew up. It wasn't until my senior year in high school that I was able to actually take a course in psychology, and that just further reinforced my interest. But I was never interested in psychology from the standpoint of being a clinical psychologist who focuses on remedying disease or pathology. I was really more captured by the idea of how you take psychological principles and apply those to the rest of us and make those people better, allow them to thrive and excel. From the very get-go, that was my interest. So next year I went to college. I had my first college-level course in psychology, was equally inspired. My professor in that class, his name was Dr. Victor Agruso, We became lifelong friends. But during that journey in college, I also became interested in police work, so much so that I joined the local police department and went through the academy in my spare time and managed to be commissioned as a police officer in Springfield, Missouri. And I really found that interesting because I liked, at the time, being a young guy, the dynamics of getting into a patrol car, not knowing what's going to happen from one minute to the next. The radio could go off and could be a barking dog call, which is no big deal, or it could be a shooting or something that's more weighty. And for a young person, that's kind of pretty exciting stuff to be able to go out and handle those things. And it allowed me to see human behavior in very stressful conditions and to see how people can rise up from difficult situations and still excel, both the police officers themselves, but also many of the people that we respond to help may have been having a hard time, but worked their way through it. So ultimately, when I graduated from college, I was a much better student. I was offered fellowships to go to graduate school and get a PhD, and I had to make this big life decision, whether to be a career full-time police officer or to become a psychologist. And ultimately, I decided that psychology would be a longer-term way to stay engaged. I know if I had been a police officer, I would have retired at age 45. And here I am at age 70 and still being able to engage as a psychologist. It was a good decision in retrospect.
Yeah, I agree. I'm glad you became a psychologist, Mike, because I've thoroughly enjoyed reading your work over the years. So yeah, it's been good for me. I'm glad that you're doing that.
Yeah, what struck home in several of your texts, especially Headstrong, are the little vignettes which you pop in, whereby you relate theory to real-world experience. I just think that's so vital because it helps to bridge that gap and provide that contextual understanding, linking the theory to real-world application.
I am capable of writing things that no one understands. You know, I am a bona fide scholar. I could write an article that nobody in their right mind would ever want to read. But I do really enjoy writing books like Headstrong, which were intentionally written so that anyone with curiosity in the field could read about a psychological principle and then by illustrating it with an experience from police work or something else I've done in life, make sense of it. And that's the very same reason that I blog several times a year for Psychology Today. The idea is to take psychological science and craft it in a way that everyone can understand it and appreciate the importance of it and the relevance of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really important. I think the translation is key. Like, I think we all know academics sometimes get a bad reputation for being in their ivory towers, and having that translation is so important. Coming back to some of the articles you've written on Psychology Today, you present these non-cognitive factors of human performance, things like grit, things like hardiness, resilience, those sorts of things. Can you describe what are non-cognitive factors, and maybe using the examples of hardness and grit, what are these things and why are they important?
Absolutely. This goes back to the 25-75 rule. Let me just comment on the 25-75 rule, and then I'll drill down to your question. So the audience might be interested in knowing that the first experimental psychology laboratory was founded in 1879 in Germany. So you can see how far back psychology as a scientific discipline goes. But most of the research through those years that's focused on human performance is focused on cognitive abilities like IQ or aptitude test or SAT test, things of that nature. And it's been a really productive line of research, but consistently through the last 100 plus years, what we've found, scientists have found, is that these cognitive factors, let's use IQ as an example, at the very best account for about 25% of variation in performance. So yeah, it matters. It matters a great deal if you have a really high IQ, really good academic cognitive talent. It helps predict how your freshman grades are going to be or how well you may perform in the workplace. But let's flip that. What about this other 75%? So frankly, a lot of that 75% is undetermined. A statistician would call it error variance. I mean, we know something's going on there. We don't know exactly what. So when I talk about non-cognitive factors in affecting human performance, I'm thinking about things that don't have so much to do with how snappy your brain is or your IQ, but rather things that are strengths of the heart or the gut, like motivation or grit or hardiness and your ability to overcome adversity, to stick with your mission and achieve success. And not just achieve success, but to do so not at the cost of your psychological well-being. In other words, it's one thing to push through a difficult situation and win the fight, so to speak, or win the battle or achieve the goal more generally. But if the cost of that is your psychological well-being, that's not good. So non-cognitive factors could be just any number of a host of things which contribute to that ability to both excel, that is perform, but also to adapt. And as you mentioned, hardiness, which is your ability to overcome existential crises in life, but come out feeling okay about it, is important. Grit, which is the passionate pursuit of long-term goals, is super important. My work with Angela Duckworth illustrates that. And if I sat down and thought long and hard about it, Martin, I might come up with a list of like 50 things, but we don't have time for that. But those are 3 good examples: grit, hardiness, and just character strengths in general.
Yeah, I really like the article that you wrote about psychological body armor. I think that's a really nice way of describing these things. That it's just like the armor of the mind. Could we do a little deep dive into grit? That's something that people ask me a lot. As a psychologist who works in high performance environments, I'm often asked about grit, what it is and why it's important and how we develop it. So how did you start working on grit first and foremost?
Well, almost being in the right place at the right time. This is maybe 2004, somewhere in that time frame. And the really famous psychologist Marty Seligman from the University of Pennsylvania, who's well known for his work 50 years ago on a number of things, learned helplessness being probably the thing he's most recognized for back in those days. And he, in the late 90s, founded a new approach to psychology called positive psychology. And it's kind of what we've been talking about. Positive psychology really rang true with me because it's a psychology for those of us who do not have pathologies and substance abuse and things of that nature. We had invited Dr. Seligman to visit West Point, and he and I went out to dinner. And we're talking about this idea that I have that the military in particular is a natural home for positive psychology, for the reason being that soldiers, and I'll use the term soldier generically to refer to airmen and naval personnel, just people who serve their country in the military. It's all about being better at what you do and growing and developing new skills and being able to overcome adversity and so on. So during that conversation, he said he just brought on a new graduate student named Angela Duckworth. And so no one knew who Angela Duckworth was in 2004. Right? So I had a call with Angela and told her all about West Point and about how we bring new cadets in to West Point each summer, about 1,200 new cadets. And they go through something called Cadet Basic Training, which is like basic training for militaries all around the world. It's meant to be a challenge. You get up early, you get haircut, you're away from mommy and daddy for the first time, perhaps, and make them do things like obstacle courses and such that they didn't think that they'd be able to do. And in doing so, create these challenges for them to overcome and build confidence. That's the whole thing, right? But cadet basic training has a certain attrition rate associated with it. So as you might expect, rigorous training, if we bring in 1,000 people, then you might lose a certain number. And as Angela talked about her concept of grit, she was just kind of coming to terms with it then, which she defines as the passionate pursuit of a long-term goal. It occurred to me that to get into West Point is a long-term goal. It's not easy. We start with about 50,000 applications, and we end up taking about 1,200 cadets each year. They're highly motivated. They have a lot of talent. Their cognitive skills are really off the chart. They are equivalent to the Ivy Leagues in terms of test scores and things of that nature. But they're also athletes and they're leaders. They've been team captains. So this really great group of people. And even with that, cadet basic training is a real gut check. So some of them didn't make it through. And it seemed to me that if we could collect data on the relationship between grit and success during cadet basic training, that would be a really interesting experiment to do. So I was able to make that happen. So for the incoming class of 2007, which means they arrived in the summer of 2004 at West Point, every new cadet candidate on the first day of training, before we really got our hooks into them, this is a really important point. On the first day of training, before we had socialized them into the military, we gave them the grit test, among other things. And then we followed them through their first year at West Point. And lo and behold, what we found is that grit was the only statistical predictor of which cadets managed to make it through cadet basic training. It was the only thing that really mattered. And we lost about 70 that year. We lost a great number. I did some further analyses, and I looked at cadets who had reported to the Cadet Counseling Center for emotional issues like, anxiety or, whatever. A lot of it's just in plain words, homesickness and whatnot. The new cadets who reported for psychological help, their grit scores were significantly lower than those of the cadets who persevered. So the bottom line is that grit looks like it appeared to be a very important factor in a very difficult task, which was very much more a gut check than a head check, right? So it didn't matter if your IQ was 140 when you're cold and wet and tired and away from home for the first time. That would matter in the fall semester where they're taking an academic course like calculus and physics. Sure, that mattered. But for the summer training, it was a real gut check. What mattered was their grit, their determination to complete the task no matter what. So that was the beginning of the grit studies and was one of several studies that Angela put into her dissertation and ultimately an article that we co-authored, since been cited almost 10,000 times in the literature. So there's a lot of information and misinformation about grit, I think, out in the world.
What do you think are the main sort of myths or the misinformation around grit? Can you highlight some of those?
So it's this, the pop psychology level of understanding of grit is that, it's just motivation to do something difficult, like I'm going to go out and work hard today, or I'm going to stick to my diet today, or do something relatively trivial. The truth fact is that grit is designed to measure commitment to these really long-term goals that are hard, not little day-to-day things. And then secondly, a lot of pop psychology has captured grit as sort of the end-all solution to every problem humans have. And it's not. We talked about that 75% of non-cognitive factors. It's some small slice of that. But to succeed in life, you need to have a lot more comprehensive skills than just grit. Understanding social intelligence, self-regulation, which is more the day-to-day stuff, virtues of courage and transcendence. A whole lot of things really matter. Grit's just a small slice of it.
Yeah. I used to teach a course to undergraduates and we talked about grit in that course. And I always remember one student asking me the question that I wasn't quite sure of the answer. So I wonder if you can answer it for me. He said to me, what if your long-term goal is to be a drugs kingpin, leader of an organized crime gang? Yeah. Is that grit? If that's what you want to do in life, you want to be a crime boss, head of a crime family.
I'm sorry to say, but it probably is.
Yeah.
The whole study of positive character, grit being one of them, is a subject of that question. So, for example, you think about attributes that make a good West Point cadet or an Army soldier, American Army soldier, things like courage and selfless service and honor and integrity. And if you take those very same traits and apply them in the context of a positive organization, that's a good thing. But we found like some of the most loyal people are gang members in LA and places like that. So they're loyal to their group. They have great integrity within the context of that crime group. But from the big picture of life, they are, doing nefarious things and bad things for culture as a whole. So it's a little bit of an enigma how to unpack that. Could you take somebody who's been a gang member and actually transform them into a good, productive member of society by rechanneling those character strengths towards something positive? We have some evidence of cadets that had rough backgrounds who become great officers, who had a revelation, an epiphany. Hey, I can take these same characteristics and do good things in life instead of bad things.
In regards to those character traits which you mentioned, including grit, if you were to identify with an individual that they were deficient in certain character traits, can we develop these?
So the answer, I firmly believe, is yes, but it's also a challenge to demonstrate that empirically in a scientific study. And the reason is that our measures of grit and character and hardiness and such, they're pretty soft measures. They're easy to falsify. So we don't really have a good meter stick to assess that change. Now, that said, events or experiences like a military basic training or achieving an academic goal, getting into medical school, for example, is a really long road to hoe. It's really hard to do. By virtue of going through those experiences, that tends to hone character in a positive way. Now, there are universities across the world, including many there in England and certainly many in the United States and elsewhere, who have character development programs built into their curriculum. We find it's really important at West Point. I think you could extrapolate this to any college or university setting or even other settings. There's some elements to enhancing these character strengths, of which grit is an example. One is educating people about them so they know what the goal state is, what is grit, what is motivation, what is hardiness, and then giving them an assessment and let them reflect on where they stand. So education reflection is important. And then the ability to practice using those strengths in different contexts. So at West Point, they can practice it in a leadership position within the Corps of Cadets, or they can practice it out in field training in the summer. That's important. And a very important piece, too, is having a mentor. So opportunities to lead others is a great way to become aware of and learn how to hone and to apply these non-cognitive strengths. So I think it can be done and is being done. It's hard to demonstrate sort of concrete terms.
So would you say the culture of an organisation can help shape the development of those character strengths? I think back to my own time in the British Army, and we used to have the Army's values and standards mandated as training every year. And quite often they would go in one year and out the other. It wasn't really until I left the military and I reflected back on those values and standards that I sort of realised that they essentially underpinned what I believe as an individual. These sort of constructs such as courage, discipline, respect for others, integrity, loyalty, selfless commitment, they underpin who I am now. Being in that culture certainly shaped my beliefs and characters. It almost seems like it's something that's subconsciously been ingrained within me. So if that's the case within the British Army, can that be replicated within other cultures? Can the cultural norms of an organisation shape the inherent character of an individual?
I think so. And the way I look at it is organizations can have either a positive role or a negative role. So keep in mind that if you're a leader in any organization, to some extent, you inherit whatever people go into that organization. Like the rest of us, some people will be very strong at characters, some not so much. But the organization itself, if it has strong values, reinforces those values, pays attention to them, can actually activate positive character in people and reward it and encourage it in very subtle ways. But at the same time, there's so many case histories of organizations which may give lip service to positive values, but in practice, they don't really live it. There's a great book your listeners might be interested in reading called The Black Hearts. It's about a platoon of American Army soldiers deployed in Iraq at the height of the war. And basically, the elevator version of this is they had very weak command and control, poor leadership, were unsupervised, and they had a couple of bad apples, which ultimately ended up in the murder of several Iraqi civilians. Just a horrible situation. And the question is, was it because they had bad apples in the unit, or was it because a leadership failure, or was it both? And I'd say it was a bit of both. Because if they'd had a positive organization with direct involved leaders who would make corrections on the spot and not allow this to get out of hand, I don't think any of that would have happened. That's not to say that those particular soldiers would have ever necessarily evolved into being a master sergeant or a super great soldier, but at least they wouldn't have done the bad things. So the more I study this, the more I think organizations play the most pivotal role in at least the expression of character, if not its development.
Really interesting, really interesting. And I guess that West Point as an organisation involved in that cultural architecture is a core component, getting people as they enter into these organisations.
Our mission statement is to produce leaders of character for the nation. It's not to produce lawyers or physicians or whatever. It's to produce leaders of character. We feel that it's pretty easy to select people with high IQs to get into a university. You can do that. It's a harder question to select the right people of the right character and then develop that further so that when the chips are down and you're leading in difficult situations, they can be trusted. One of my good friends was the 59th superintendent at West Point, this Lieutenant General, now retired Robert Caslin. He often says, you could be a cadet if you finish number one in his or her class in academics. But if you fail at character, you'll fail at leadership. And this comes back to Jonpaul, your point about the importance of organizations. Organizations must be well led by people of character or there will be failures.
I like the idea of character being almost elevated in importance. I think it's something that now we're talking about, it just seems so common sense to me, but I think that a lot of organizations, a lot of people don't really think of it that way. It's nothing new, is it really? We've been talking about character and virtues for thousands of years as something to aim towards, yet it's not something that's always pushed to the fore in terms of how our character traits, or our virtues, our values influence our performance of discrete tasks in high pressure environments.
You know, Martin, the trouble is it's a natural human tendency to want to optimize immediate short-term profits or wins at the expense of long-term success.
Sure.
So if you look in your news feeds and read about organizations that are found to have misused funds or to exploited customers, like red credit card customers, I think, it was one example. There's Wells Fargo Bank was widely cited as having some real issues along those lines in the last few years. And there's other examples. If the quarterly profit is more important than 10-year success, then it just sometimes channels people, takes their attention away from doing the right thing. We see that in sports too. So there are sports organizations, for example, the National Basketball Association. I've done a lot of work with the San Antonio Spurs. And when you walk in and get a briefing from the Spurs leadership about what human performance means, the first thing you start hearing about is character. And way down the line, it's what your leaping ability is, or some of those more physical things. They can deal with that. And in fact, over the last 25 years, they've been able to sustain organizational excellence. Well, the general manager at the time we were having this conversation said that when he first became general manager, They had a player that was really good, great rebounder, later went on to help another team win a couple of championships, but he was just poison around the team. It took him 6 weeks, but he managed to trade him. He said it was the best trade he ever made. Even though he missed his rebounds and so forth, that person was such a bad influence on the cohesion and chemistry of that, the positive cohesion and chemistry of that team, that, yeah, that might have helped them win that year. It would have been very destructive over the long term. So I think you can extrapolate that to all kinds of organizations. The pitfall is, again, just this eye on quarterly profits or winning this year over long-term success.
I've certainly seen that as well in professional sport. My experiences of working with professional athletes and coaches, they're often called the maverick. I think in this country, they're known as the maverick. And I remember talking to, again, a high-profile coach about some of the pressures that he had to play the maverick because they were immensely talented. But he just said they just didn't fit within the team. They didn't share the values. Their character was not aligned with his ideals for that team and had to make that sacrifice for the good of the organization for the team.
You know, I think all of us who are listening can think about organizations you're part of, whether you're a teacher at a high school or a public school or you work at a sales department someplace. We all work in the context of teams. And if you're any age at all, you probably worked in different teams in different contexts. I would hope this all rings true, that your personal experience sort of reinforces this notion that positive culture is really, really an important way of activating and rewarding these non-cognitives, which then contribute not just performance for the quarter or this particular season, but performance in the long haul and how well you feel about what you're doing. Are you deriving meaning and purpose from what you do?
So it sort of falls into that idea that there is no I in team and sort of highlights the importance of team cohesion. If you look at some of Professor Anthony King's work, he often highlights the importance of team cohesion as a determinant of operational effectiveness. Mavericks, yeah, they may have their place at times. However, for those who work in extremist contexts, they're probably likely to be quite divisive.
JP, I know American football is an odd sport. You probably don't follow it that much in England. But if you ever take a look at the Army West Point football team, the back of the jersey says West Point and their number. It doesn't say Jones or Smith. It says West Point and their number. And that's no accident.
So Mike, just going a bit broader now, what are your thoughts in terms of the development of human performance optimization as a scientific discipline in itself? Having sort of studied and followed the development of HPO for over the past 14 years, I've sort of witnessed how it's all came together in the form of the US military's holistic force fitness doctrine, for example. But what's your thoughts as to how it's developed as a concept since its initial inception back in 2006?
Yeah, so one thing I think I would say is that we are better poised, we meaning the scientific community and the human performance community, are better poised now than we would have been 30 or 40 years ago to develop evidence-based, sort of scientifically informed practices to enhance performance. And you mentioned earlier about the prevalence of snake oil in this area. I see this all the time when speaking with our leaders, be it the Chief of Staff of the Army or the West Point Athletic Director. I talked to our Athletic Director a few years ago, and he said that one of his big problems is every week some entrepreneur comes in with a great idea, and he calls them shiny objects. He says, here's a shiny object you're going to want to buy, and it's not based on any scientific credibility. And it's really tough. You know, I would not expect our Athletic Director or the Chief of Staff of the Army to be an expert in human physiology and that stuff. And so snake oil sales people are really good at what they do. We're getting to the point, though, that it is possible now that you can take these scientifically informed approaches to truly enhance performance. So we're better poised. Right? But I think that also requires leaders and decision makers to be better consumers of that information and to be able to recognize a shiny object from something that's legitimate. And maybe part of that's just having a trusted agent that you can call upon. So the athletic director would occasionally call me and say, hey, so-and-so came with this idea. It's a little patch you put inside a football helmet. It'll prevent brain injury. Well, no, sir, it won't. It'll make that person rich, but it's not going to really help the football player. So that's part of it. Another thing to consider is that by its very nature, human performance optimization is extremely multidisciplinary. There's a genetic component or epigenetic component to it. There's a physiological component to it. There's a brain science component to it. You can range from real hard test tube type science all the way up to leadership experts. All of those contribute. And so just to take a myopic sort of approach, just take one of those would not be fruitful. It's much better to cast your net widely. I've seen organizations in the Army that do just that. For example, in an HPO setting to optimize soldier performance, they'll hire a strength coach, but they'll also hire a psychologist, and they'll also hire an exercise therapist, physical therapist. 8 or 9 different disciplines where a soldier or maybe a team member can go and get different perspectives on how to make him or herself better. So I think the multidisciplinary piece is important.
Shiny object syndrome is, again, something that I wrestle with on, well, at least a weekly basis, with people coming up with the latest gadget, the latest thing. I guess it comes back to education, like you were saying earlier, that people need to recognize what is marketing and what's an evidence base. And I think it's very easy to be taken in by the marketing.
When I was working for the Chief of Staff of the Army, some marketer, entrepreneur had approached the Special Forces and said, there's a thing in your brain called a Z-wave, and we know how to train it. Well, there's no such thing as a Z-wave. And there's just not a shred, I mean, not even a teeniest little shred of science behind it. It's just astounding that we live in cultures where you can turn on TV and see ads for things that are supposed to boost your brain power if you're 65 or older. And they don't. They don't do that, but you're allowed to sell things and to deceive people. And another piece of it is that, say you want to be diligent, and I'm going to do my research, quote unquote, on something. Most people's idea of research is to go to Google and type in the keywords and see 3 or 4 articles that pop up, and they've done their research. For a scientist, research is 2 or 3 or 4 years of hard work done in a lab and with empirical, statistically validated findings. It's not just looking something up on the internet for 5 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the sound bite for the episode for definite. If you only remember one thing from this episode, it's that.
Yeah.
So, Mike, could you provide us with an insight into the role of psychology then, and how the application of psychology has influenced the conduct of warfare, sort of focusing more on that military side of things?
Well, that's the book Headstrong, pretty much all 20 chapters or whatever it is. So I'm not sure I can give you like a good soundbite on that, but the logic is that, psychology, which as a discipline and profession is the scientific understanding of human behavior, plays a central role in every aspect of life. To be psychologically sound means to do the right thing at the right time and to derive meaning and purpose from life and to succeed and excel, etc. You might think that success in something like war would just be simply a matter of who has the most firepower, who has the biggest, bestest guns and rockets and so forth. But you can go all the way back in history. So long as there's been recorded history, there's been lots of Davids and lots of Goliaths, right? And in almost every case, these intangible aspects of warfare and human conflict, that is, the psychology of war, have been real difference makers. So you look at a huge country like Russia attacking Ukraine. It's not a small country, but you would think that just based on military might alone, Russia could have crushed them in 6 weeks. But there is a spirit, so to speak, of war, which is, in other words, another form of psychology, I guess, of motivation and grit, maybe, and determination to prevail even when the odds are against you. So psychology more directly influences training. How do you train troops to be effective soldiers? There's a huge psychology of that. There's also a huge role of psychology in training cognitive skills, better decision making. So I've done 10 years worth of research in an area called situational awareness within the military context, where we know how to measure how soldiers and their leaders size up a situation and can predict what's going to happen next and how to train that and make it better. The role of simulations, like immersive simulations, in making better decisions is an important application of psychology. Teaching soldiers skills to overcome or be invulnerable to combat stress so they are not as likely to be vulnerable to PTSD and related disorders. Those are just some. I could just go on and on about the importance of psychology. And my thesis in that book was that for wars of the 21st century, psychology is arguably the most important science. You look back at World War I, chemistry was really important. It might have been the defining science. Bigger, better, badder explosives, right? And mustard gas and things of that nature. World War II, physics was arguably the deciding science, radar and the nuclear bomb. There's a historian named Byron who talks about there being a World War III, and that's basically the Cold War, and their sort of information technology and computer science was super important. In World War IV, which he says we're in now, psychology is the defining science. Ultimately comes to do with shaping hearts and minds. Look at the situation in Israel and the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Unimaginable destruction on either side, and they're still at it. I think in the end, it'll be psychological factors which win the day.
Yeah, that's a real interesting point. Indeed, within my own lifetime, the British Armed Forces have been engaged in 4 major warfighting operations. So you had the Falklands War, the First Gulf War, Second Gulf War in Afghanistan. And the fundamental nature of those conflicts was arguably very, very similar. They were all volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and indeed often lethal. However, their character was very, very different, and that changing character was driven both by technological developments and obviously changes within society. And if you think to what's happening today in regards to the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, 50% of these conflicts is arguably fought online. It's about who wins the social media battle, so to speak, who gets their point across, who has the best narrative. And that sort of highlights the importance of developing cognitive ability.
Well, it brings up a very important point. It's the weaponization of social media, which is really a psychological manipulation as well. In some ways, I think that ISIS and Hamas are better at leveraging social media to further their cause than the other participants in those conflicts. And you said a very important thing. If you can use social media to achieve a military effect, for example, as you may know, we got an upcoming election here in the U.S. If President Putin decides that one candidate or the other would be more favorable in terms of policies towards Russia, he can unleash his social media hounds to manipulate through the very social media platforms American attitudes in a way that really is disruptive. And I think it's a big part of the conflict you probably see on your news feeds, things like January 6th and things of that nature. You use social media to stir up those passions based on misinformation and achieve a goal that you might not be able to achieve with conventional weapons. There's more than one way to bring a country down. And social media, right now, it looks to me like one of the most potent weapons, and one that we need to get smarter about to develop countermeasures and educate our population so they're not so prone to manipulation. That's all psychology. That's social psychology.
Yeah, super interesting. Does it fit into this concept of situational awareness, being aware of social media? Would you consider that situational awareness?
I think in the strategic picture, at the strategic level, it certainly would be. To the extent that misinformation could affect your ability to correctly predict what's about to happen next and influence your actions. Most of my research was down at the squad and platoon level, where we want to know if a platoon leader is going to go left, right, or up the middle, and they knew where the enemy was and things of that nature. But in a larger sense, the strategic sense, knowing fact from fiction would be really important, dramatically important in terms of managing expectations and making decisions as well.
It's a bit like that scientific analogy in that we have a lot of noise in the data and we're just trying to identify some form of meaningful signal. But now, if you look at, obviously, sort of the media narrative and what goes on online, there's just so much noise in the background. We can see how certain adversaries can potentially hide in the shadows and even add to that noise. And it sort of makes you wonder whether or not the degree of influence which one could have in that sort of environment could potentially lead to a cascade. And that cascade then may lead to potential downstream effects with certain actors influencing people in nefarious ways via information and false news, so to speak.
Well, yeah, it's really frightening. And you think back 200 years ago, in fact, I read a biography of the Lincoln years. Back then, if you wanted to plant misinformation about the best you could do is stand up on a soapbox in a park and talk to 10 or 15 people. Or maybe you could write an op-ed for a newspaper. But now anybody can whip out their phone and you can write the most bizarre, ridiculous things that they're not based in fact and fan the flames. Just this morning, I saw a little Facebook meme that basically said, well, how outrageous it is that U.S. congressmen all retire on a $174,000 a year pension, even though they just served 2 years. Well, there's not a shred of truth in that. It is so far from the truth, and yet people will share that, and it reinforces a belief, and that makes them angry at the government. I think they were trying to make people angry at the Biden administration, but it stirs the pot in a really bad way. So yeah, I think it could lead to catastrophic circumstances, to include the downfall of democracies and potentially even a very large-scale kinetic sort of war, which none of us want.
I'm going to throw you a bit of a hand grenade question here, Mike. So get ready.
Okay.
You mentioned your 20 plus years of research on situational awareness. So how do we get better at it? We need to improve situational awareness at the squad level, at the societal level. How do we do it?
So at the small unit level, it's a matter of training, some degree of selection. We want to put the right people in leadership jobs, but also training and experience. So I was working with one of our former secretaries of defense, Jim Mattis. He'd been an advocate for radically improving training for our small unit forces. His inspiration was and I think he's right, for tactical sorts of decisions, and you extrapolate that to other situations besides the military, sort of day-to-day decisions, what really makes a difference is experience. And so it's hard to take a platoon out in the actual field and lead them through a 3-day exercise, and every soldier and the 30 soldiers in the platoon get much of experience other than swatting mosquitoes and being sleepy. The platoon leaders probably get some value out of it, but no one else much does. Well, with modern immersive simulation technologies, you can take a soldier, a junior leader, and put them in an immersive environment, and they can run through 5, 10, 15 battles or engagements in a day. And so the idea is you enhance situational awareness by exposing them systematically to different variations of the types of decisions they might have to make out in the field. The U.S. Air Force and Air Forces around the world do this pretty well already with flight simulations. So an American fighter pilot who engages an enemy aircraft in combat will have already finished 1,000 such missions in simulation. So they're not going to be surprised by anything the bad guy does. They're ready to go. We can now do this for police officers and soldiers and others who lead in dangerous situations, firefighters, first responders. And you build this huge library of scripts, which allows the person to recognize, oh, here's what's going on, and here's what's probably going to happen next, and that defines situational awareness. I think it becomes harder to train strategic leaders in the same manner because of the complexity of the decisions and the input they're getting.
Coming back to that social media question then, are you seeing that leaders within West Point, are you having to teach them about the kind of things that they're reading in social media? Is that now infiltrating into the education of future military leaders?
Yes, it is. In my own course in cognitive psychology, in fact, just next week, we're going to have a whole lesson on misinformation and misinformation management. And I know from cadets, just hearing what they've said in other courses in other departments do address it. We certainly do not have a core course that every cadet takes in that yet. But it's such an important thing that it's being integrated into courses across the curriculum.
Yeah.
We try to make our future Army officers and leaders savvy and good about interpreting such things.
Yeah. I guess being savvy comes back to that other 75%, right? It's one of those non-cognitive factors.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. And how do you define it? How do you measure it? Those are hard things, but it needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely.
In basketball, which I played, it's called court sense. Knowing where you were on the court and what's going to happen next. And I, unfortunately, although I'm tall, I'm 2 meters tall, I didn't have very good court sense, so I wasn't a very good basketball player. But that's probably a selection issue. I don't know if I could ever have learned it. But regardless of our occupation, but again, whether you're a teacher or you work in the trades, you have a court sense. You know what's happening and can recognize things and respond accordingly.
Yeah. I recognise we've had you on for a good hour now, Mike, and I've loved this chat. I've learnt tons. It's been a really good deep dive. I just want to hand it over to you, really, for the final word. What do you feel are like the most important things that we talked about, or anything that we haven't covered that you really want to talk about before we wrap this one up?
Well, the thing that comes to mind is that organizations that employ people in dangerous situations or challenging situations, I think they almost have a moral obligation to go about systematically giving their members the tools and skills and abilities to perform well and to adapt well to the situations they're going to encounter as a result of their occupation. And so I might just close with that these organizations need to take human performance optimization seriously and to know it's more than just winning the game, tonight's game, or the quarterly performance report. It's a long-term commitment and engagement to be excellent across long periods of time. And in that way, you have real true meaningful human performance optimization.
Yeah, that's great. A great way to wrap things up.
So, Mike, just to close up with, if people want to know more about you, what's the best method for them to reach you?
Well, I welcome them to email me. It's mike.matthews@westpoint.edu. And I'd be happy to respond to any email inquiries you might have.
We'll pop a copy of that in the show notes.
Yeah, and I'd like to add the Psychology Today blog is awesome. So definitely read some of the articles on there if people are interested in what they've heard.
Well, good. I enjoy writing Psychology Today. I love my readership. You would be amazed how many inquiries I get through that blog. It's been a very good experience.
Yeah, it's great.
Mike, many thanks for your time today, bud. It's been a great session and I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, JP.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you for joining us on the Optimizing Human Performance podcast, a Wavell Room production. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to like and subscribe so that we can keep improving. And remember to visit wavellroom.com to find their latest articles, podcasts, and newsletters.
If you know someone who could benefit from our discussions, please refer them to our show. Your recommendation is our highest compliment.